I never got a break.
All right. Good afternoon. I hope everybody had a good weekend. We'll start shooting around while we wait for the monitors to come up. So there's that. We need to talk about environmental scanning, which was the chapter I forgot to do on the first exam last time, so we'll be on the second exam. And I told you that I would give you some time today to finish up your responses to the critical thinking challenge on how to write a good article review for this class. So if you have any questions, I'll also be around to answer those. If you have concerns or comments that you'd like to make about the article review. A number of groups have turned theirs in, so that's good. If you want to revise it and resubmit it, you're welcome to do that until this evening. I'll give you until midnight tonight, but I'm going to give you class time. So we'll stop at about 1:15, and I'll give you the remainder of the 30 minutes so that you can get your groups to work on those assignments for the critical thinking challenge. As I said, I know a number of you are going to want to gain bonus points for your exam, so that's an opportunity for you to gain bonus points by doing really, really well on those critical thinking challenges. So, environmental scanning is really important. One of the things I've told you before that I think about is that I would kind of like to be a history professor because we know how the Civil War ended. And marketing's not like that. You have to constantly keep up with the environment. And the environment presents both opportunities and threats to businesses. And so it's a challenge to keep up. What is popular today? What is a huge company that's in existence today that may not be there in the future? Well, any of them could rise or fall based on changes in the environment. So there are both opportunities and threats. And when we talk about planning, we talk about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The opportunities and threats are external, and the strengths and weaknesses are internal, and how you're going to deal with those. So we've got to continually try and gain information and roll with that so that we can modify and adapt our organizations to survive in the long term. We want to survive in the long term. So there are 5 environmental forces that impact businesses and marketing. They're social, economic, technological, competitive, and regulatory. And one of the things that you have to think about and that makes marketing interesting and unique is that we talk about these as distinct forces, but they're often, and I will give you an example at the end here, of how these forces integrate together. So we talk about them as distinct, but they're really not distinct silos that you can think of, this is just a technological force. In many instances, technological forces have implications for what? Well, economic, for example. If you can put workers out of jobs by being more efficient with robots and technology, that's an economic force, right? But it's got a foundation in technology. It is hypothesized that over half of the jobs in existence today will not be in existence in 10 years. That's pretty frightening. I heard this stat on NPR while I was driving to work one day, and I was really about half of the jobs will not be in existence. And then I was going to pick up groceries for my business, and I went to Sam's, and have I showed you all this? The Freos. How many of you go to Sam's and get samples? It's great to go to Sam's and get food samples. You can have your entire lunch at Sam's if you go during the right times of day, right? And you don't have to pay. They used to have all these people that would stand out there and hand out samples of all kinds of stuff. They're now getting rid of them. They've got these machines. And these machines are great because they don't need breaks. They don't complain. They don't call in sick. They don't give you more than one sample. You have to scan your Sam's card, and it dispenses one sample. So it's a constantly changing environment. We have to keep on the lookout for these things. And so it's really important that we understand these. And these are examples of how all of these things really impact each other. So demographics or social changes. What's going on in the world? Well, there are approximately 7 billion people on the planet today, and that is increasing. However, in countries that are what we consider industrial or post-industrialized, what is generally happening to their populations? Not in the United States, because we still have, at this point, some immigration, but if you go to places like Norway, Finland, Sweden, what's happening to their population? They're actually decreasing. Why? Their birth rates are down, and why are their birth rates down?
Safe sex.
Yeah.
Okay, fundamentally, I guess that's a correct answer, but in addition to that, why are people having fewer kids in places like Norway? And actually in the United States, people are having fewer children.
Education.
What? I'm sorry, what'd you say?
They're more educated and they're more wealthy and they put off more.
Okay, they're more educated, they're more wealthy. What does that have to do with not having kids, though?
We no longer need 5 kids to run the farm.
You don't need 5 kids to run a farm. That's exactly it. If we went back historically, you had to have a lot of kids because we all lived on 70 acres with our mule, and we had to plant what we were going to eat or sell, and that took a lot of labor. And so children were an economic asset. When you achieve industrialization and you start having things like we no longer rely on child labor in the industrialized world or a post-industrial economy, children are no longer an economic asset, they are an economic liability. I hate to say that, but they are. It takes a lot of money. If you had a kid today and you want to raise it and send it to college, how much should you better plan on spending on that kid? Huh? You're pretty close, yeah. It's about $1 million is what you're going to take to raise that child and send it to college. And if you want to send it to, someplace other than UCO, it's probably you better plan on more than $1.2 million or more than $1 million. You want to send them to Harvard or something like that, it's going to cost considerably more money than that. So they're expensive, but in the vast majority of the world, children are still an economic asset. Maybe they are still needed to work in places in the developing world, and so the population is still growing. But in the United States, we are seeing a decline in the younger population as the population does get older. It's also larger and more diverse. And for the first time in world history, we actually have 5 generations in the workforce. So there are traditionalists. Those are people that are probably your grandparents, or maybe for some of you, your great-grandparents' age, depending on how young they started having children. And they're still having to work because a lot of them didn't, have maybe great retirements, or things happened. They got pensions, but those pensions went broke as companies went broke, and they've had to increase their working lives beyond what we had anticipated. So we have these traditionalists in the workforce. Their children are the baby boom. So the traditionalists were the World War II generation, and their children, the baby boomers, are in the workforce as well. What are traditionalists like? They generally respect authority, they like structure. There are challenges in the workforce as a result of these 5 generations being in the workforce. Baby boomers have a tendency to be somewhat like traditionalists, although they're a little bit more flexible. Then you come to my generation, which is Gen X, your generation, which are the millennials or Gen Y, and now the children of the early millennials, my brother's generation. My brother was born in 1979, so depending on which author you listen to on generational cohorts, he's either a Gen Xer or a millennial. A lot of them put 1980 as the time period. He was born in July, which is right smack dab in the middle of the calendar year. So he's either a millennial or a Gen Xer, but his cohort, if you're a millennial or an early millennial, have started having children that are now entering the job market. And in fact, some of them are actually in college. Some of the generation after yours are now actually entering college as well. So there are 5 generations in the workforce, and this presents real challenges. What do traditionalists want? They want you to work 40 hours for 40 hours worth of pay. What does your generation want to do? Not work 40 hours. You want to work smart, not hard. And so this is creating conflicts in the workforce, right? There are shifts. What's happened historically, if we went back in time, the population was spread throughout the United States, and largely in rural areas. What's happened? Well, during the early Industrial Revolution, the population moved where? From the south to the north and east. Into the industrial, what is now called the Rust Belt states, where there were large factories. Where is it moving now? It's moving to the south and west. Why?
More land.
It's not more land, better climate. People, it no longer the big factories in the north and east, and we're not really an industrial society anymore. And so people in your position, as you graduate with your degrees in marketing or finance or management or accounting, God help you, are going to want to do what? Are you going to have to work in an office somewhere? Not necessarily. My brother is a tax attorney. He can work, his clients are not located in Oklahoma City or Dallas or New York. They're located all over the country. And so he could work from anywhere. He can do that job from anywhere. Where do people want to be? They no longer want to be in the north and the east. A lot of the population at the early Industrial Revolution was within a few miles of the Canadian border. Where is it now?
Texas and California.
It's within a few miles of the coast. The biggest trends are shifting towards being within a few miles of the coast. Why is that? People want better climate. Also, what happens with the elderly? What happens? What's one of the fastest growing states? Texas and Florida. Why? Retirement. As they retire in places like New York and Minnesota and stuff like that, they want to do what? Move south where it's warmer and it's easier to get around. So there are these shifts towards the southern and western states. Also part of the social culture, values, attitudes. We're seeing that in record numbers in terms of shifts in these that have provided enormous opportunities for marketers. When I started college years ago, seems like forever ago, I could never have anticipated that gay marriage would be legal in any state, let alone all 50. It's now legal in all 50 states. What kinds of things has that presented as opportunities for marketers? It's opened up entire industries for wedding planning. And these, what had not been a group that had heretofore been even thinking about those kinds of things. Now you've got all of these people that now have a whole new market that they can market to. And so we're seeing huge shifts in our values, attitudes, and ideas. We're seeing that with the Trump administration and NFL, football. When one player decided to kneel, it was viewed as abhorrent. Now, after a couple of years, what's happened? It's not just the players that are kneeling, it's who? It's the owners. This social force has been the one thing that has, for the first time in NFL history, united players and owners. Historically, what have players and owners been in the NFL? Pretty antagonistic towards each other. Why?
Paychecks.
Yeah, the players always want more what? They want more money, and the owners want more money. They want to keep as much money as they can, and so this is one of those things that's uniting. So it's a social force. Are there differences in culture even within the United States? Absolutely. So the way you market something in Oklahoma may be different than what you market in where? New York. What can you think of as differences in things that are culturally different from New York to Oklahoma in terms of marketing?
Oklahoma is more conservative, so we can't just portray controversial ideas like, I don't know, gay marriage on. We can't advertise that as much in Oklahoma as in New York.
Okay.
Marriage plan.
What about clothing? Are there differences in clothing?
I wouldn't advertise overalls in New York.
You wouldn't advertise overalls in New York. You don't see a whole lot of Wranglers in New York City being sold. They have a tendency to wear really depressing dark colors. I don't know why. Black is popular in New York. Everybody seems to like to wear black. You know, we wear a lot more vibrant colors. You can see a lot of differences in sort of the color palette from region to region. Economics, so we've got macroeconomic conditions, things like gross domestic product, unemployment, price changes. What are some other forces that impact that? What's one of the things that's impacted, for example, gas prices over the last couple of weeks? Hurricanes. That impacts the entire gross domestic product of a nation as we face enormous challenges in terms of the natural disasters and things like that. Then you also have microeconomic things that you have to look at. Consumer income, gross. Things that you should know about from your text are the differences between gross, disposable, and discretionary income. As those things, disposable and discretionary income, go up, what do we have opportunities for? To sell more stuff. What's generally been happening to the average consumer or the average worker with regard to their disposable and discretionary income in the United States? It's actually stayed pretty flat. It hasn't grown at quite the rate it has in other nations. And so looking at those kinds of trends is important. Those kinds of microeconomic trends. Inventions and innovations, technological. Now these can be really difficult to predict. What's going to be the hot trend? Before there was Facebook, there was what? MySpace. What happened to MySpace? It's still there. I think you can go to myspace.com and the platform is still there, although some of the platforms are not. One of the ones that was really popular that got going and started a whole new thing at the award ceremonies now. They are now awarding, for example, I think at the People's Choice Awards and some of the others now have a new category of award, and it's for social media creations and social media stars. One of the big platforms that started that is gone, I think MySpace actually may still be there. Let's look and see if it's still there. Well, one of the ones that started, and a whole lot of stars started on it, or social media celebrities started on it,
Vine.
was Vine. And Vine is what? Gone. See, MySpace is still there, but Vine is, as far as I know, completely gone. So predicting these kinds of things. Why is it that Facebook is going to stay or has not fallen and Vine has, or MySpace is not nearly as popular as it once was? These are really, really hard. Why do you think it is that these things tended to stay, whereas others left?
They differentiate, so like MySpace you can do multiple stuff, and with Vine it was just those short videos. So they, with adding all these extra elements, they lowered the risk of that happening.
Okay. One of the things that I thought Facebook would go away and MySpace, I mean, I was absolutely wrong in my prediction on this. I thought MySpace would be the more dominant platform because MySpace was more customizable. You could do more with it. You could go out there, and if you weren't a web developer, you could actually customize your page by grabbing code on the web and then putting it into your page so that you could have graphics and all this stuff. And the reason that I think Facebook stayed around and MySpace didn't is because MySpace was cleaner. Facebook was cleaner. MySpace was really clunky, and people got tired of waiting for their friends' pages to load as they put all of this stuff on them. But I thought that that would be one of the attractions that people really liked, and I was wrong. Facebook was a cleaner platform. Why is Twitter still there? It's even cleaner than Facebook, and it's more, more limited. Although Facebook is still the dominant, but will they always be the dominant? I don't know. They've got a whole lot of users, and the marketing potential is pretty great. Competitive forces that we have to think about in our business. What types of competition do we have? Are we selling gas? For example, that's pure competition. There's lots of gas stations in Oklahoma City. You can get on gasbuddy.com or something like that, find an app and figure out what's the cheapest. And so they all stay within what happens with gas prices. When one lowers their prices, what happens across the board? They all tend to, except in Stillwater. For a long period of time, I went to OU, and my brother went to OSU, and in Stillwater, Oklahoma, two guys owned all of the gas stations in Stillwater. And the gas prices in Stillwater during that time period had a tendency to be about 20 to 30% higher than the rest of the state. And remarkably enough, those two individuals had breakfast once a week on Wednesday mornings together. And it was amazing how the prices stayed high in Stillwater. That's actually, if you can prove it, a restraint of trade, and it's a violation of the law. But that was more of an oligopoly. They had two people that owned all the gas stations in Stillwater, and so they had higher prices. But in most instances, in terms of gas stations, you have pure competition. There's lots of different gas stations out there. What do we have? We have, in the Oklahoma City area, we have OnQ, we have 7-Eleven, we have Shell, we have, what else? Love's, Conoco, all of those. There is one that has agreed, 7-Eleven, the owners of 7-Eleven, and what can you get in Tulsa that you can't get in terms of gas stations?
Quick Trip.
Quick Trip. They have agreed not to compete against each other. That's actually a restraint of trade. It's illegal if they can figure out, if they can catch them doing it. In a monopoly, so if you have a pure competition, you're going to have to really market yourself. You're going to have to face challenges from other competitors. If you have monopolist competitions, you have many sellers compete with substitute products within a price range. So what are some monopolistic competition where we see monopolistic competition in pricing? Well, you have substitutes for things like for coffee or for tea, for various soft drinks, right? What do you have? You have Dr. Pepper, Pepsi. What are they all going to be priced about the same? About $1.50 for a pop in a vending machine. An oligopoly occurs when you have very few competitors in the market. And the example here that your text lists are the airlines. How many airlines are there? There used to be more. There's fewer today. Anybody ever heard of Trans World Airlines? TWA has gone broke. So there are a few. There's American, Southwest, United, Delta. They keep merging. And they all know what their routes are, and they compete against each other. And generally, they don't engage in price wars. They know which routes each one of them have are their most popular and their profitable routes. And they actually try to avoid going head-to-head in price wars. And then you can have pure monopolies. What's a pure monopoly? You get these in very limited instances. Generally speaking, we have regulations that prohibit monopolistic type environments with certain exceptions. Regulated industries and utilities, for example, are monopolies. Why is it that OG&E doesn't really care? How many of you are in Edmond? Live in Edmond. So if you live in Edmond, there's a monopoly that sells your electricity to you. Who is it? Edmond Electric. It's owned by the city of Edmond, and other places across the state it's OG&E. But you don't have a choice between OG&E or Edmond Electric. They have a monopoly. They're the only ones that are licensed in that area. And so why is it that OG&E doesn't do a whole lot to advertise and stuff like that? They don't have to. Which, by the way, where does Edmond Electric get their electricity from?
OG&E.
OG&E. They buy it from OG&E. What? What was your question?
Oh, I don't have a question. You asked a question.
Oh.
She said answer.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I talked through my questions half the time. So yeah, they don't have to advertise. They have the monopoly. You're going to have to buy it from OG&E or Edmond Electric if that's where you're at. Although, maybe there is an option now. What can you do?
Solar power.
You can put on solar on your house and you can sell it back to the grid. I've known several people who've done that. Or, what else can you do in Oklahoma? Wind. Yeah, you can build wind turbine, and I've known several people that have done that. They're now powering their entire houses, and they're actually selling electric back to the grid. The regulatory environment is enormously important. Understanding the regulatory environment, particularly as you go into things like international business. You're going to have to understand what kinds of laws and forces you're going to have to deal with in those countries. In the United States, we have what's called a system of dual sovereignty. So we have two sovereigns. We have a national government, and then we have state governments. So we have the national government, and then we have states. This is the idea of dual sovereignty. And where they overlap, these are what's called concurrent powers. What are the concurrent powers? This is one of the things that a lot of people argue is makes our system inefficient and not necessarily attractive to do business in. What's one of the biggest concurrent powers? The power to tax. So you're taxed doubly in the United States because you have a national government that taxes you, and then you have what? State governments that tax you. And it's not just one. If you're going to do business nationally, you're going to have to deal with what? How many systems? 51. If you're doing business nationally, you're going to have to deal with 51 different systems, right? There are 50 states, one national government. So you're going to have to think about the tax implications. Not all states, for example, charge what? If you go to Texas, what's one of the big advantages to moving right across the Red River? What? They have sales tax. They don't have one type of tax. They don't have what? They don't have income tax in Texas. So a lot of corporations look for these things in terms of setting up their corporations. But it's one of the things that's a challenge in the United States. There are very few federal systems in the world. Most countries have what's called a unitary system of government, where all of the power of the government is derived from the national government. And so you don't have these multiple taxing authorities. And so it's much more efficient. It means that you also deal with regulations in 51 jurisdictions in terms of how you're going to sell your product. One of the things that's happened with regard to cars is the emission standards on cars actually went up, or the emission standards increased and made cars more fuel efficient as a result of one state in the United States. What's that state? California. California had very strict emission standards, and it forced all other, before the national government and the EPA got on the bandwagon, it forced them to increase their emissions or lower their emissions that they were putting out, because you couldn't sell to California, and California is a what? It's a huge state. If California were its own country, what would the economy of California be? It would be something like the 6th largest economy in the world. So they forced basically car manufacturers and auto manufacturers to lower emissions if they wanted to sell cars in California. One of my colleagues wrote a textbook for when I was a political science professor. He wrote a textbook, and he wanted to sell his textbook to high schools because at the collegiate level there are probably 60 or 70 people that sell textbooks or write textbooks for publication. But there are only about 6 authors that write American National Government textbooks for high school civics courses. So he looked at this and he said, this is a really good opportunity to make money, right? Because if you got 50 or 60, what happens to your textbook at the college level? You're competing against a whole lot of people. Whereas if you can sell at the high school level, high school civics, you've only got 5 or 6. It means that you're going to sell a whole lot more books. There was a discussion in his textbook about different types of federalism. So we have this idea of dual sovereigns. The national government is a government of limited jurisdiction. The states are the government of general jurisdiction. The national government, for example, is allowed to regulate interstate commerce. The state governments are allowed to regulate intra-state commerce. So the national government, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, is allowed to regulate commerce among foreign nations, among the states, and with the Indian tribes. Intrastate commerce has been regulated to the states. So he wrote this textbook and he talked about models of federalism. Prior to 1930, we had what was called the layer cake model of federalism, where you had a very small layer, kind of like a wedding cake, at the top that was the national government, and you had the state governments, which were the much more active forms of government. And where they two meet, where you have like frosting and the layer cake, you can think of that as concurrent powers. So we had this small national government, and we had this big state government. After the 1930s, and we'll talk about this in a minute when I give you my example, that flipped. The national government became much more active using the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the states became less active, and they actually started to work together in a lot of areas to develop policies and stuff like that, and we got what was called the marble cake model of federalism. The marble cake model of federalism. This occurs because the Great Depression, the states couldn't deal with, and so they started putting problems that had heretofore been states' issues on the door of the federal government. And so there were a lot of things like the federal government gives grants and aid to the states to deal with these issues, and so there's this mixing. And my colleague wrote about these two models in his textbook, and the state of California said, we won't allow your textbook to be sold in California schools unless you do away with this discussion of layer cake and marble cake models. You want to know what their reasoning was for that? They said that the discussion of layer cake and marble cake would promote unhealthy eating habits in high school students.
Pretty serious.
Yeah. See, this is an example of if you want to sell things, you have to understand these kind of regulatory schemes. So one state blocked his textbook, and you can't get a publisher to pick up your textbook unless you can sell to California and Texas. You have to make it through the curriculum committees of those two states in order to sell your textbook. Why? Because they've got huge high school populations. Because again, what's happening with regard to the demographics in this country? They're moving where? South and west. Now, if you want to sell textbooks, you have to compete, and you have to get it approved by two curriculum committees, one in Texas and one in California, that are diametrically opposed on the political spectrum of each other. You've got tree-hugging, bunny-thumper, liberal, commie California. And you have red-blooded, conservative, bunny-hunting Texas. And you got to get your books past those two curriculum committees. So this is an example of how you have to understand these ideas in the regulatory environment. So examples of the integration of how these forces all work together. The Great Depression. The Great Depression begins with the stock market crash in many respects, although you can see it before that, before 1929 with the stock market crash. That's a good starting date, though. You can see a difference in the farm income, for example, before that, and you can see echoes of the Great Depression happening. What happens during the Great Depression? Well, we have huge social upheaval as a result of people moving out of places like what happened in Oklahoma during the Great Depression. We had the what? The Dust Bowl. And how many of you who have gone to Oklahoma high schools remember watching a horrible movie or reading a horrible book in your English classes called The Grapes of Wrath? Horrible book. John Steinbeck. Depressing. You want to slit your wrists after you watch it, right? But this was the Depression, and the Dust Bowl caused a mass migration out of places like Oklahoma. It had huge economic impact. So there were these social upheaval. The people in California didn't want, and what was the pejorative term that they attached to people from our part of the country that moved there? That was during the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Northerners moved to the South, and they were called carpetbaggers. Oklahomans were called, what's the pejorative? Okies. So you have this social force, these people that are moving as a result of an economic condition, the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl. It had a huge impact on technology. What happened at places? What's the #1 agronomy school in the country? Right up the road. What is it? Oklahoma State. As a result of these things, we got huge advances in what? Soil science and farming, that increased technology. Why is it that we can now, for the first time in human history, largely as a result of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and changes in agronomy, we've now gone for the first time in human history where the number of obese people in the United States has exceeded the number of people that are hungry. It's a result of these they came up with great ways of preserving soil science and getting higher yields out of crops. That in effect affected the competitive environment. Who was able to do this? Well, it was companies like Monsanto that could pay for the research. So farming, we've gone from small farms to what? Large corporate farms, and who controls most of those? Ralston, Purina, Monsanto. We've gone from this largely open competitiveness to a really oligopoly in terms of that. It also impacted the regulatory environment because the federal government stepped in, and this is one of the reasons that we get this marble cake model, because they started giving grants and aid. And so they started regulating things that they hadn't regulated before. Like what? Food safety through the USDA and the FDA. What's another one? The civil rights movement had huge impact on the business economy, right? What happens during the civil rights movement? You have this huge social force that impacts a big sector of the economy. Almost everything. Once you start opening up what had heretofore been closed businesses to an entire group of people, it opens enormous marketing opportunities. There is an African-American historian named Elizabeth Cohen, Lizbethcohen, who writes something called The Consumer's Republic, who talks about how African-Americans and women exercised real power through the power of consumerism once we got the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and they started controlling their own economic destiny. So it had this impact on the economy. It also had impacts on technology in terms of increasing their ability to participate and go to school and impact. How many of you have seen a movie called Hidden Figures recently? Things like that. The competitive and of course the regulatory environment, we went from having de facto or de jure segregation to it being illegal to segregate. Now we still have some evidence of de facto segregation, but that was a regulatory environment, and it impacted all kinds of businesses. For example, two cases, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. And Katzenbach versus McClung. Sister cases from 1964. You get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1950 for desegregated schools and places of public accommodation that were held in public trust, governmental trust. Katzenbach versus McClung and Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States dealt with this in the private sector. So the Heart of Atlanta Motel was a motel that was wholly located within the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. They did not serve African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 says you have to. And they said, we are not involved in interstate commerce. We're only involved in intrastate commerce. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, you're not. You're involved in interstate commerce because when people travel, they have to have some place to go and stay. And therefore, the federal government can regulate you. Things that the federal government had never regulated, they never regulated hotels and restaurants, were now being regulated by the federal government. Katzenbach versus McClung involved Ollie's Barbecue, which was located in the state of Georgia. They weren't on an interstate, they only catered to locals. They didn't allow African Americans to eat in the dining room, they would allow them to take away food from the back door. They said, we don't engage in interstate commerce. And the United States Supreme Court said, yes, you do. Where did you get your ketchup packets? What's the #1 ketchup producer in the United States? Heinz. Where's Heinz manufactured? New Jersey. Where did you get your salt? Where did you get your tables, your chairs? So all of these forces combined. Technology is another one. It's increased productivity. It has allowed for an increase in the GDP of our people. It's had huge social impact. What can you now do with technology that you couldn't do 15 years ago? That's become an issue in the social world. People are becoming, one of the things that I think you ought to think about is people are becoming far less concerned, as Alessandro Histi says, about privacy. And I used to say you ought to use, with regard to Facebook, the mama test. Would you want your mother to see this picture of you? But most of you have mothers that are my generation, they're Gen Xers. And we know that you're friends with your parents, so maybe you don't care if your parents creep around on your Facebook. So maybe you should use the granny test. Would you want your grandmother to see you, beer bonging at the frat party on Saturday night? It's had a huge impact on our social and our economic. We can now buy stuff a lot easier. We are seeing the disintermediation of products being sold directly from producer to consumer as a result of these technological forces. And it has increased competition in many respects. A lot of smaller producers are now being highly competitive with things like Walmart because they found niche markets that they can sell into. Walmart is the largest seller of things like what? Razor blades, soap, textiles, and diamonds, by the way, in the United States. They are the largest retailer of diamonds. Bet you didn't know that. Walmart. There are these small retailers as a result of this technological thing that have entered the market. What is it? You don't want to go and you don't want to buy razors, so you can buy Dollar Shave Club and have them mailed directly. They're finding ways. So it's increased, this technology has increased our competitive environment in many respects. All right, so that's where I will stop so that you all will have time to work in your groups. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer those. As I told you, you'll have the rest of the time to finish that submission and get someone to submit it to the Dropbox. A horrible movie or reading a horrible book in your English class is called The Grapes of Wrath. Horrible book. John Steinbeck. Depressing. You want to slit your wrists after you watch it, right? But this was the Depression, and the Dust Bowl caused a mass migration out of places like Oklahoma. It had huge economic impact. So there were these social upheaval. The people in California didn't want, and what was the pejorative term that they attached to people from our part of the country that moved there? That was during the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Northerners moved to the South, and they were called carpetbaggers. Oklahomans were called, what's the pejorative? Okies. So you have this social force, these people that are moving as a result of an economic condition, the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl. It had a huge impact on technology. What happened at places? What's the #1 agronomy school in the country? Right up the road. What is it? Oklahoma State. As a result of these things, we got huge advances in what? Soil science and farming, that increased technology. Why is it that we can now, for the first time in human history, largely as a result of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and changes in agronomy, we've now gone for the first time in human history where the number of obese people in the United States has exceeded the number of people that are hungry. It's a result of these they came up with great ways of preserving soil science and getting higher yields out of crops. That in effect affected the competitive environment. Who was able to do this? Well, it was companies like Monsanto that could pay for the research. So farming, we've gone from small farms to what? Large corporate farms, and who controls most of those? Ralston, Purina, Monsanto. We've gone from this largely open competitiveness to a really oligopoly in terms of that. It also impacted the regulatory environment because the federal government stepped in, and this is one of the reasons that we get this marble cake model, because they started giving grants and aid. And so they started regulating things that they hadn't regulated before, like what? Food safety through the USDA and the FDA. What's another one? The civil rights movement had huge impact on the business economy, right? What happens during the civil rights movement? You have this huge social force that impacts a big sector of the economy. Almost everything. Once you start opening up what had heretofore been closed businesses to an entire group of people, it opens enormous marketing opportunities. There is an African American historian named Lizbeth Cohen, Lizbethcohen, who writes something called The Consumer's Republic, who talks about how African Americans and women exercised real power through the power of consumerism once we got the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and they started controlling their own economic destiny. So it had this impact on the economy. It also had impacts on technology in terms of increasing their ability to participate and go to school and impact. How many of you have seen a movie called Hidden Figures recently? Things like that. The competitive, and of course the regulatory environment, we went from having de facto or de jure segregation to it being illegal to segregate. Now we still have some evidence of de facto segregation, but that was a regulatory environment, and it impacted all kinds of businesses. For example, 2 cases, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. And Katzenbach versus McClung. Sister cases from 1964. You get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1950 for desegregated schools and places of public accommodation that were held in public trust, governmental trust. Katzenbach versus McClung and Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States dealt with this in the private sector. So the Heart of Atlanta Motel was a motel that was wholly located within the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. They did not serve African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 says you have to. And they said, we are not involved in interstate commerce. We're only involved in intrastate commerce. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, you're not. You're involved in interstate commerce because when people travel, they have to have some place to go and stay. And therefore, the federal government can regulate you. Things that the federal government had never regulated, they never regulated hotels and restaurants, were now being regulated by the federal government. Katzenbach versus McClung involved Ollie's Barbecue, which was located in the state of Georgia. They weren't on an interstate, they only catered to locals. They didn't allow African Americans to eat in the dining room, they would allow them to take away food from the back door. They said, we don't engage in interstate commerce. The United States Supreme Court said, yes, you do. Where did you get your ketchup packets? What's the #1 ketchup producer in the United States? Heinz. Where's Heinz manufactured? New Jersey. Where did you get your salt? Where did you get your tables, your chairs? So all of these forces combined. Technology is another one. It's increased productivity. It has allowed for an increase in the GDP of our people. It's had huge social impact. What can you now do with technology that you couldn't do 15 years ago? That's become an issue in the social world. People are becoming, one of the things that I think you ought to think about is people are becoming far less concerned, as Alessandro Acquisti says, about privacy. And I used to say you ought to use, with regard to Facebook, the mama test. Would you want your mother to see this picture of you? But most of you have mothers that are my generation, they're Gen Xers. And we know that you're friends with your parents, so maybe you don't care if your parents creep around on your Facebook. So maybe you should use the granny test. Would you want your grandmother to see you, beer bonging at the frat party on Saturday night? It's had a huge impact on our social and our economic. We can now buy stuff a lot easier. We are seeing the disintermediation of products being sold directly from producer to consumer as a result of these technological forces. And it has increased competition. in many respects. A lot of smaller producers are now being highly competitive with things like Walmart because they found niche markets that they can sell into. Walmart is the largest seller of things like what? Razor blades, soap, textiles, and diamonds, by the way, in the United States. They are the largest retailer of diamonds. Bet you didn't know that. Walmart. There are these small retailers as a result of this technological thing that have entered the market. What is it? You know, you don't want to go and you don't want to buy razors, so you can buy Dollar Shave Club and have them mailed directly. They're finding ways. So it's increased, this technology has increased our competitive environment in many respects. All right, so that's where I will stop so that you all will have time to work in your groups. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer those. As I told you, you'll have the rest of the time to finish that submission and get someone to submit it to the Dropbox.